Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. We have had a 2-week break, but now we are back, so welcome. Also, we would like to give big thanks to our speaker, S.Friedman, who is a scientist, a New York Times acclaimed great philosopher and artist, and also a great speaker of ours. Also, we'd like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience. Please make sure to join our club and philosophical talks weekly, and feel free to ask your questions and give your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, as always, Aaliyah, for the introduction. Thank you for your continued participation in the talks, making them possible. I also want to thank the American Consulate at Almaty, Elmira, Dana, everybody that's associated with making this platform available to explore philosophical perspectives on every possible type of issue. And remember, philosophy has something to say about everything. That's the nature of philosophy, and that's what draws us to it, that it can provide unique perspective, that other approaches, to human life don't quite reach the level of. Okay, this week's talk is the philosophy of generality, seeing what is in front of our eyes. Now, when I say seeing, I'm using that metaphorically in a sense. It applies, this talk, to every sense, and I'm using seeing in the sense of appreciating, understanding, comprehending, what we are immediately and directly experiencing through whatever sensory modality. So everything I'm saying here applies to the sightless as much as to anybody else. I'm just using seeing because it's often used as a metaphor for understanding. And that also kind of ties into this concept of generality. And let me clarify what that is from the outset. The more general something is, the more elements or objects or individuals it applies to. Something that is true of the citizens of Almaty, and only the citizens of Almaty, is not as general as something that's true of everyone living in Central Asia. Not as general, which is not as general as something that applies to all human beings, which is not as general as something that applies to all living things, which is not as general as something that applies to all existing things. Philosophy operates at the highest level of generality, and so philosophical propositions are aiming to apply to everything. So, of course, what we're saying is going to apply to people sighted or sightless, with whatever types of sensory challenges they might have. That's the nature of the general response that philosophy is providing to experience, to human life. It's part of its power. But when you think of generality, levels of generality, sometimes you think of seeing things from a great height, where you're looking down as if it were from an airplane or from outer space. And when you see things from such an elevation, such a height, you can discern patterns, but you lose detail. That's actually in the nature of scientific modeling, which will abstract from a lot of the details of a situation in order to come up with a mathematical model or theoretical representation that's able to capture, the majority of the phenomenon. Philosophy does not model. Philosophy is not engaged in theoretical activity. Philosophy is engaged in mathematical activity. Mathematics, from a philosophical perspective, is operating at a lower level of generality. Philosophy achieves the highest level of generality, but also the most precise specificity. So philosophy is seeing everything from the broadest possible perspective, the most general perspective, but leaving nothing out. That's the nature of the philosophical enterprise, of philosophical representation. It is the nature of rigor. So, what we have to deal with here is another investigation into an aspect of rigorous representation. And notice, I repeat myself, right? I repeat myself on purpose. It's necessary to hear things repeatedly and from different directions, different angles, in order to get a just sense of whatever it is we're trying to come to terms with. Now, that's the nature of anything that we're encountering within heuristic space, anything that we're trying to understand within the realm of science, of society, of anything other than philosophical truth at its limit, which deals with a divergent space, where we're not bringing things together, we're distinguishing them. Because remember, we exist in difference, in distinction from everything else. That's the nature, ultimately, of a rigorous space. It is a distinctive space. And again, just to kind of review something that I went over last time before the break, one of many ways to represent an epistemic space is like this, series of points. Each point is distinguishable from each other point by its location. A way to represent heuristic space, where elements of heuristic space is like so, where elements are grouped together conceptually. That's what concepts are doing. They are grouping things together into concepts of dog or cat or chair or table or person. Whatever the concept might happen to be, is achieving a grouping of diverse elements within otherwise divergent epistemic space, where things are not grouped, not clustered. Okay. The reason in particular that I use seeing in the title and generality in the title is they were presented to me in the very first philosophical book I ever read, and actually early on in that book, in its opening pages, as I recall. The book, and I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. The book is Alfred North Whitehead's Science in the Modern World. And let me show you Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher who worked at Cambridge at the end of the 19th century and at Harvard early in the 20th century. Here is Alfred North Whitehead Alfred North Whitehead. He worked with Bertrand Russell on Principia Mathematica, one of the monumental mathematical enterprises to attempt to reduce all of mathematics to logical form. It failed. It failed because of the work of Kurt Gödel, a great mathematical logician of the 1930s, who proved in 2 short papers that its enterprise was theoretically impossible. An extraordinary result in the history of thought. It gained Gödel a position at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study alongside Einstein. Well, but nevertheless, a monumental undertaking. That is Science in the Modern World. That is actually the very edition that I read. And the story is that I was reading books in science. That was my interest at the time. I was around 12. I went into a bookstore. I saw that book on the shelf, and I thought, oh, another book on science. It turned out not to be science. It turned out to be, even though Whitehead was a mathematician, a philosopher, an educated, and something of a scientist, a little bit of a scientist, it was basically philosophy. And it became my introduction to the subject at a very sophisticated level. It's a difficult work. Some authors writing about the history of philosophy point to Whitehead and point to this book and other works of his as among the most difficult in the history of the subject. Okay, so I stumbled into this. Now, I give an account of that in Phalaris's Bull, and let me just recite that to give just some additional biographical context, autobiographical context. And then I met a book. I was reading science, but then I met a book, Science in the Modern World by Alfred North Whitehead. The title told me it was science. I was wrong. Whitehead was an early 20th century mathematician and philosopher. His book, Difficult Philosophy, some say among the most difficult ever written. I read it on the bus back and forth to summer classes in math and computers at Caltech. On those bus rides, I began philosophy at 12. Everything else would be easy by comparison, even philosophy at Harvard. And the point of that story is also a heuristic one, not to be afraid of encountering what is difficult and potentially beyond one's understanding. Everything that one encounters for the first time is not well understood, not understood nearly as well as it will be on subsequent encounters, no matter what it is. I still tutor people. I like tutoring. It provides both intellectual stimulation, social contact. I am helping people. That's enormously satisfying. I am paid for it. That's essential. But at the same time, every time I help somebody with a subject, no matter how many times I've helped people in the past with algebra, I learn, I see, I understand something in a different way, something in a way that adds to my fundamental understanding, not just of that subject, but all subjects, all of math. It also deepens my sense of what understanding is and how it can be achieved. So, don't be afraid of encountering what otherwise seems intimidating and formidable to the point of being opaque, of not allowing entry with reasonable understanding. Every time you revisit it, like a battering ram, you will revisit it with somewhat enhanced appreciation, understanding, and over time, worlds will reveal themselves. Okay, so, and the earlier you begin any such enterprise, the better. I began reading philosophy at 12. I was not, intellectually capable of understanding everything I was reading at that stage, but it positioned me to understand the most difficult results in philosophy, years later, when I had more experience, was more intellectually mature. And certainly that early introduction to the subject made my results broadly possible, made these talks possible, made Phalaris's Bull possible. Okay. But the most important point to raise about science in the modern world is something that Whitehead makes in the opening pages, as I mentioned. And it's something that I remembered as soon as I read it, and remember to this day because of the profound effect it had on me, again, without my fully understanding its implications. And what Whitehead wrote, and by the way, Science in the Modern World was a series of lectures. So it turns out a lot of important works in the history of many subjects, especially in the history of philosophy, have been delivered as lectures, not originally as, in written form. And I think that has an advantage, because when you are presenting something orally, it has to be presented in a way that's a little bit more understandable on the surface than it would be if somebody is, alone in one study and writing sentences that might become increasingly obscure. Okay, here, when you're dealing with an oral communication, it has to be more accessible, right? So I think it serves the subject, and it serves a subject like philosophy, and Science in the Modern World is a work in the tradition of oral presentation, lectures on the subject. What Whitehead wrote early on, and this is owing to his having been a mathematician, is the circumstances that matter most decisively are those of such great generality that no one ever sees them, because they are always right in front of our eyes. Okay. Well, that addresses this issue of something that is extraordinarily general, that applies to everything, everywhere, and something that is specific, immediate, something that is always present, pressing upon us, pressing upon our senses. That convergence of the general and the specific at its extreme, at its limits, is another way of representing the nature of rigorous representation. It also relates to a point that I've stressed often. It relates to the nature, the essence of existentialism, a philosophical movement tradition that I find is not well appreciated, not well understood. Existentialism, especially in a lot of its 20th century forms and the work of people like Sartre, even Camus, was seen as a philosophy of despair. A few years ago, I had to help somebody with some work in a graduate program in psychology. And we had to analyze a public figure, someone well known either from literature or from public life, from the perspective of a particular psychoanalytic modality of our choosing. And the perspective that we investigated an individual from was existential therapy, a branch of psychotherapy, a way of dealing with human psychological issues. And in reading about existential therapy, which I had encountered in the past, but in rereading about it for this project, I read through the works not just of famous existential therapists, but of famous existentialists that they were deriving their therapeutic orientations from. And what I found is no clear statement, no distilled statement anywhere as to what existentialism really amounts to. Part of the philosophical enterprise is to achieve clarity, is to achieve a simplicity of representation that reduces what seems diffuse and obscure to something that is so clear, so concentrated, so distilled that we can both understand it and use it in diverse situations, in diverse applications. And I never found that in the literature, but Because again, it's a philosophical enterprise, really, to achieve that type of clarity. It's not something that is given to us at the beginning of a subject. Well, and one doesn't find it in Kierkegaard, who is often seen as the progenitor, the originator of existentialism as a philosophical tendency. Well, I've also, in the past, given my sort of distillation of what existentialism is, simply the notion that we cannot view the world from the outside, but we imagine we can and suffer. Can't leave these circumstances, but we imagine that we can see the world from the perspective of a novelist writing in the third person, or the perspective of a deity completely outside human experience and looking down on it and seeing past and future. Whenever we kind of speculate on what someone's capabilities are, what our capabilities are, we're really attempting to see the world from the outside. When Sartre writes, existence precedes essence, what he's saying, not as clearly as I would like, but what he's saying is that, no, we can't view the world from the outside to see what we are in essence, where essence implies what we are and what we will become. It's existence that will reveal what we are to ourselves and to others. So when we are encountering the world, we are encountering it from here, now. There is no privileged position to view the world from. That is the point of Einstein's physics. Einstein was doing the physics of existentialism. We gain no deeper perspective on the philosophical issues of existence, the nature of existence, and all of the circumstances that pertain decisively to our experience as existing things by viewing the world from the moon, or from Mars, or from the edge of the universe. If the world resolves, if there is a solution to our situation, our circumstance, broadly and deeply, it presents itself right here, right now, and independently of all possible future experience. And you say, well, what if such a representation doesn't exist? Well, for one thing, my articulation of the logic of epistemic space is designed to provide that, okay? But if that were not available, if we didn't seemingly have, a solution that satisfied the requirements of immediacy, of being a solution here and now, well, we wouldn't rest until we do. In the same way that we demand ultimate simplicity in our theorizing. One of the most compelling aspects of Einstein's work is the simplicity of its final forms, E equals mc squared. That's a very simple relationship. That's simpler than Newton's law of gravitation. So we demand that heuristically, and we will continue to push the process until it becomes articulated, until it is available to us in a form whose simplicity cannot be pushed any further. So that's why we're interested in this Whitehead consideration as to the circumstances that are so general, they apply everywhere. That's the nature of philosophical results, but they are always in front of our eyes. And that's why we're not seeing them, not discerning them. It relates to the short story by Edgar Allan Poe, the great American poet and short story writer, who created the detective story genre. And he wrote a story, I think it's Murders in the Rue Morgue, I think. I haven't read it for a number of years, so I might be wrong on the title, but it's one of his most famous stories. But in this particular story, there's an item that people are looking for, and it's hiding in plain sight. It's right in front of everyone's eyes, and so they never discern it. It doesn't stand out. Okay? Well, immediacy. What's here, what's now, what's in front of our eyes. Okay, that's what we want to address. That's what we want to come to terms with. We want to come to terms with the kind of things that Whitehead had in mind as being decisively in front of our eyes, and yet constantly, always decisively overlooked. The alternative position, the alternative representation, is what we get in certain, and I've alluded to it already, in certain theisms. Not all, but some concepts of divinity and traditions embracing certain concepts of divinity, singular divinity, monotheisms, where it's imagined that the world only resolves, only makes sense, only sort of finds its solution from wherever God is outside the world, from a privileged point, an Archimedean point, outside this realm of experience where everything is seen in totality and all the pieces are seen as fitting together in such a way that we understand everything, everything makes sense, we understand the relationship of each part to the whole. That's a view that's rejected, okay, by philosophy. And it's rejected by philosophy because that's an impossibility, right? That's not a place that is available to us to see the world from. So whatever might pertain, at some future point or, after one's death or whatever, that's not available to us right here, right now. And so what we want to investigate right here, right now is the logic of our circumstances that will allow a complete resolution here and now, not over there. And from some inaccessible point. And the rejection of that distant, remote, transcendent, inaccessible to human cognition, human perception, the rejection of that point is something that is common to other religious traditions. It is what one finds in Buddhism, for example, where samsara, the world of suffering, of change, is seen as being equivalent, when it's understood properly, to nirvana, the complete solution, so that this world of suffering resolves right here, right now, in the perspective of enlightenment to the state of nirvana, the unconditioned state, the aconceptual state. We talked about how what Buddhism attempts to achieve is a deconceptualization, a stripping of the world of concepts in the same way that rigorous space deconceptualizes, because no concepts are possible where things are radically divergent. Concepts are clusterings. A rigorous divergence doesn't permit, by definition, clusterings. So philosophical rigor achieves that elimination of concepts, really not elimination, the concepts don't arise, that Buddhism also aspires to. But the Buddhist logic has elements of belief, contention that don't rise quite to the level of philosophical rigor. So Buddhism is a religion. We also find in Hinduism the identification of Atman, one's ultimate self, with Brahman, the self of the universe. So again, the world resolves right here, right now, with the identification of the self of the individual and the self of the world of existence. Not resolving over there, but right here. And that's the tradition embraced by various mysticisms. mysticisms within the Jewish tradition, within the Christian tradition, within the Islamic tradition. Mystical union with God is something that imagines a resolution right here and now. And it imagines that resolution because when one merges with God mystically, merges with the deity mystically, well, when all things become one thing in God, all concepts vanish, all distinctions vanish. There are two ways to achieve this stripping the world of concepts that represents an ultimate solution, a rigorous solution. One is the limit of divergence, where things don't cluster in the first place. That's the nature of rigorous philosophic space. The other way is at the limit of convergence. All things become one thing, all distinctions vanish. And so concepts no longer can take a foothold in that space. That's the point. And again, I know I've shown this, but again, I'm showing it again because each exposure, I think, can provide a little bit, additional or deeper understanding. That's the point of HCE, that the heuristic converges on the epistemic at its limit. All things become one thing. Okay, but let's deal with the nature of our experience right here, right now, and how we come to terms with it. Heuristically, what are we seeing? What's in front of our eyes, heuristically? Again, we've explored this. Whatever can be named, described, identified, recognized. It's the projection of the past into the present. It's how we've patterned experience, how our brain has learned to group, organize experience for ultimately the value, the benefit of being able to manipulate experience, to survive, to anticipate, to know that something that looks like a hot stove should be avoided. Right? Anything that can be identified or named is a heuristic element or feature of the world. When I say that the logic of heuristic space is A equals A, that's an identity. One thing is equal to something else. A person yesterday is equal to that person today. That's the nature of the heuristic, where things are grouped together based on approximate, not rigorous similarities, right? Because whatever distinguishes two things, someone yesterday, someone today, is a point of rigorous distinction that is essential to the nature, the fabric, and the meaning and the ultimate significance of epistemic, rigorous philosophic space. So we are seeing the familiar, we are seeing the heuristic. We are not seeing the epistemic, we are not seeing the philosophic, and we're not quite seeing what Whitehead is pointing to as decisive to our understanding. Philosophy has, throughout the centuries, sought to come to terms with what is genuinely present to one's senses. It's a, and what the status of that is. Starting with Plato, we get this notion that this is a realm of appearance, the world of change. The heuristic is somehow not the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is something that's not changing behind this facade of changeableness. There was this belief in Plato that the eternal, the unchanging, was the ultimate reality. It's actually it's a tradition that, as Neoplatonism, as newer forms of Platonic thought, has been important ever since Plato wrote, so for over 2,000 years. And it actually dominated the thinking of a 20th century painter who was my favorite artist, Mondrian, Pierre Mondrian, a Dutch artist. The Dutch are extraordinary in their contribution to the history of world art. They produced Vermeer, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Mondrian. Mondrian, I'd like to show you a picture of him. There's Pierre Mondrian, Dutch painter. Mondrian painted works like this. You've probably seen them in some form or other. They've been a major influence upon modern design. But Mondrian was not painting designs. He was not painting designs for tablecloths. What he was doing was painting his sense of the unchanging reality behind the appearance of the confusion, the messiness of this world that we are experiencing, if you like, heuristically. He's painting the ultimate reality behind appearance, the ultimate Platonic reality behind appearance. It's actually a notion that not only comes up in Plato, it comes up with an earlier philosopher, Heraclitus, who is many people's favorite philosopher from the days of ancient Greece. His work survives as fragments, so aphoristically. So a lot of people who are drawn to the aphoristic style of writing philosophy, including me, tend to embrace the work of Heraclitus. He made a comment, one of his aphorisms is, the reality is hidden. Okay? And in the sense of being behind the appearance of things. That, by the way, is not my sense of the relation between the epistemic, the ultimate reality, and the heuristic. But I'll go into that just a little bit later. Well, probably the most important modern figure who embraced this distinction between appearance and ultimate reality lying behind the appearance is Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century. One of the great philosophers, I mean, for me, the great philosophers are Wittgenstein, Kant, and Aristotle from one point of view. Kant made the distinction between phenomena, like what we experience with our senses, and what is beyond our senses, that is contacting our senses and ultimately causing sense perception. He called that realm that we cannot directly access, because all we can access is our realm of sensory representation. He called that the noumenal realm. But a problem with something like the noumenal realm that we cannot in principle experience is what we cannot in principle experience cannot fundamentally be known. And the nature of that term epistemic and the nature of the whole Socratic accomplishment in philosophy, in creating really the major tradition of Western philosophy, is its focus on what can be known. And whatever can't be known in principle, in some sense, represents an error in our thinking, in our representation of the circumstances, leading us to posit the unknowable as being something fundamental to our circumstance. The focus of 20th century philosophy has not been on the noumena, that again is radically inaccessible, and from my standpoint, from the standpoint of my philosophical work, illusory, resulting from an error in our thinking about the world. Again, related to the notion that we could imagine seeing the world from the outside. where here we are, and there's this noumenal realm that we can sort of have a sense of, as if we were intuiting something about the world, as if we could see it from the outside. That's not, for me, the path to ultimate philosophical rigor, rigorous representation, and the solution to our circumstances. I operate philosophically within what in principle is knowable. So, a lot of 20th century philosophical work has focused upon not the noumenon, but the phenomenon, right? What we can experience directly. The philosopher from Harvard, he actually was my philosopher in the Wittgenstein course I took at Harvard, Stanley Cavell, eminent, highly admired philosophical figure. Later in his life, he died a few years ago, but late in his life was apparently lecturing. This was after I was far gone from Harvard. I wasn't aware of these lectures, but apparently he was giving talks on what he described as earliness, on what we encounter when we first encounter the world, okay? Where before our experience has been processed by the mind, processed by our neurophysiology, organized into constructs, into linguistic constructs, clustered into objects that we recognize repeatedly as, again, approximately the same moment to moment or day to day. A pre-linguistic world, the world that Adam and Eve might have encountered when they were first created. The world that we would experience if we were born with our full cognitive powers and were suddenly looking out on the realm of experience. Earliness. These days in the realm of nutrition, right, we tend to be steered away, guided away from highly processed foods. Well, philosophy, in this tradition that Cavell was embracing, was interested in investigating the world in its pre-processed, unprocessed, fully natural form, if you like, on first encounter. The form that mostly took was investigating what's called sense data. Sense data are another term for Kant's phenomena. When you hear, in fact, continental philosophers from France and Germany talking about phenomenology, they're talking about the study of phenomena, like how things appear, what we sense about the world. Well, in the Anglo-American tradition, like English and American universities, people in the 20th century were talking about sense data. What was the nature of your immediate sensory response to the world before those sensations, those colors, those sounds, those smells and tastes, whatever, were clustered together, grouped together, as if the world were, if we're speaking visually, and even more than visually, a two-dimensional array, a mosaic of colors that we encounter initially and then over time learn to cluster together based upon persistent patterns. But sense data was a term that was used by philosophers like John Austin, who was an English philosopher from Oxford, probably the most admired philosopher when I was at Harvard. The philosopher most admired, the most admired philosopher that people had actually worked with. So Wittgenstein had an extraordinary reputation when I was at Harvard, but Wittgenstein had been dead, many years, and I'm not sure that anybody in the faculty at Harvard when I was there had ever had any dealings with Wittgenstein, had known Wittgenstein, worked with Wittgenstein. But there were a number of professors when I was at Harvard who knew John Austin. And so of philosophers that people knew had worked with, Austin was his most admired. And Austin investigated at length this phenomenon of sense data, right? And just to draw out a few more details about it, when I was an undergraduate, I don't know how it's done these days, but at the time, one's first philosophy course was a seminar. The philosophy faculty did not want beginning students to be lectured to. It took more of a Socratic approach. It wanted its potential philosophy majors to be engaged in sort of small group conversation discussion, of philosophical issues under the direct and really commanding guidance of either a professor or graduate student, but they wanted dialogue. They wanted people to actually come to experience certain things that were essential to making progress in philosophy. And one of those things that at the time was considered important to experience was this world of sense data, what the world looked like. And I don't remember now how many sessions were spent on this issue, coming to see sense data, but it was a number. It might have been 3 or 4, and I'm not sure how many people actually ultimately succeeded, to the satisfaction of the professor. I'd been doing philosophy for a long time. I was familiar with the nature of sense data, so I had an advantage, right, in that situation. But the point is, it was a task that the professor set the class. You must see this two-dimensional array in front of you as being the primal reality, the given reality, this condition of earliness that then gets organized into objects. And the organization into objects becomes heuristic. So although these terms were not used at that time, the epistemic corresponds really to what they were trying to achieve in terms of the discernment of sense data, right? And again, think of a mosaic. Think of all the colors you see, but without being able to name the objects that they're associated with, okay? A two-dimensional array. And some of the ways that they got us to try to see it was, imagine squinting, okay? Imagine the ways that I might have recommended now are look at the world upside down, turn at an angle. So you're not seeing the objects, you're seeing just the sensations of color. You're experiencing just color, taste, sound, smell, not identifiable yet as objects. Okay? As I mentioned, it was seen that being able to see sense data, see that two-dimensional array, was essential for further work in philosophy because so many people were writing about sense data, right? John Austin was writing about it. He wrote this book, Sense and Sensibilia, about sense data, okay? So if you couldn't see them, then you couldn't come to terms with a lot of the philosophical writing of the time. Now, there's a related sort of orientation. A century earlier, sense data, were not discussed philosophically, right? It was a 20th century kind of preoccupation that I don't think is really part of the picture so much anymore. It's certainly not part of my relationship to philosophy. But prior to that, and related to that, philosophers, including Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, stressed that not seeing the world in terms of sense data, seeing the phenomena, not the noumena, was the key to doing philosophy. But, and they both said this in very similar words, that the defining criterion of the philosophical mind, the philosophical orientation, what made it possible to do philosophy at all, was the ability, at least occasionally, to see life as dream. Now, that actually intersects this notion of sense data, in that if you see the world as a two-dimensional array, it has a dreamlike aspect to it. And we know the importance historically of representations of the world as dream. Right? There's a famous section, really, of Shakespeare's, it's Tempest, where he talks about these are actors, as I foretold you, we're all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air, and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the solemn temples, the gorgeous palaces, the great globe itself shall dissolve and leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. So even in Shakespeare, at his highest philosophical moments, there is that sense of life as dream. And I still think that's actually an important orientation to experience, to really appreciate the full dimension of philosophical responses, to the world historically. There's an aphorism that I wrote that deals with it. It goes, to see life as dream is the starting point of philosophy and the halfway point back to Eden. And the point of that is that it's useful to see that, to be able to have that perception of the world. It partly makes everything seem strange. Dream-like phenomena are strange phenomena, typically. And you recoil, once you have that sense as with the response, what is this? What am I involved in here? And that's an essential sort of attitude, orientation to have towards the world, that sense of wonder and amazement and profound questioning about the nature of our circumstances. But for me, it's just the beginning of the philosophical process, right? It's the halfway point, okay, back to Eden. It's not the full achievement of a rigorous representation. And that, again, is what the epistemic represents the formulation of, right? That rigorous logic, that logic of distinction, distinctiveness. Okay, so we see there's a connection, right, between the epistemic. In fact, one way that I do represent the epistemic, that rigorous representation of the world, is in terms of the world first viewed, what we would see prior to any conceptualizations. But notice, I'm not saying that the ultimate reality, the epistemic, lies behind this world that we're experiencing. It is what we are fundamentally experiencing, but then aggregating, clustering, grouping together heuristically through basically the operation, the neurochemistry of our brains, which are heuristic devices. Grouping, clustering, discerning patterns, repetitions imposing the heuristic upon this divergent, point-wise, distinctive epistemic space. So it's not that the epistemic is behind, it's within, it's right here. It's in front of our eyes. It's ultimately what I would say corresponds to what Whitehead is aspiring to recognize. But it is not concealed, but it is obscured, let's say, by our conceptualizations. In terms of ways to approach it, we've talked about some of these in the past. One main procedure intersects the approach that Meister Eckhart, the great medieval Christian mystic, emphasized. And that is a process of subtraction. We are removing things. I've given the proclamation of Meister Eckhart's daughter, that famous line, "I am a something among some things, and so I go." In other words, I am removing from my sense of self everything except the essential existential aspect of me. And that really kind of relates to how this looks, right? Just distinctive. We're not things that can be described or named or identified or recognized rigorously. I've emphasized that the logic of heuristic space is convergent, right? These conceptualizations, these clusterings represent convergences. We're bringing things together. Objects represent convergences. Boundaries represent convergences, and boundaries create objects. Well, one can say that just as the heuristic is a convergent space, where elements are being brought together, being created by addition. When we create an artwork, we are adding elements to achieve a given result. When we are doing a painting, we are adding pigment, to a surface. When we are creating a symphony, we are adding notes, in some sequence. When we're creating a building, when we're creating anything, right? When we're creating, a rocket to Mars, we're bringing elements together, technologies together. That's the nature of an object, that's the nature of creation within heuristic space. It's an additive process. Now, sometimes we are adding silences, right? In the case of Mozart's music, he emphasized that as important as the notes are, it's the silences that are really decisive, but obviously both silences help articulate the notes. But an epistemic space is a divergent space, and we can think of it as a subtractive space. We are removing things to get to the concept of God, in the case of Meister Eckhart's sense of mystical union with God where there are no characterizations, no designations. We're removing all of those words, those terms, those categories. Well, similarly, when we're trying to get to the epistemic, the fundamental, early, unvarnished, unadulterated, unprocessed, immediate, divergent reality that we're presented with. We get there from where we are here now by a subtractive process. We remove presumption. We remove speculation. We remove assumption. We remove our sense of the past, right? The past cannot guarantee the future. Well, you look around, what are you seeing? Everything you're seeing, everything you name, everything you can identify, that's the past. That's That's how objects have behaved up till now, that are clustered together. And when we look at those things, we're not just seeing sense data, images, we are seeing or imagining how things are going to continue to behave. We are imagining that door, as a door that will stay there, for some period of time, that we can at some point, maybe tomorrow, open and walk out of. We are anticipating. Our objects are rich with anticipations. That's how they help us survive in this world. They don't achieve salvation. Salvation, the logic, the rigor of religious salvation is given by the rigor of philosophical representation, which is one in which the past cannot guarantee the future, cannot guarantee how that object or any object will behave moment to moment. We want to subtract from our thinking our sense of anticipations related to every object in our experience. It's hard. I know it's a hard task. But still, that's the nature of the task, right? Remember, it's a desirable result we're talking about, right? We're talking about a complete solution to the world, something that is rigorously constituted. It's going to be something then excellent, right? Desirable. I'm using a term from Spinoza's Ethics. Spinoza concluded his ethics with the line, everything excellent is as difficult as it is rare. Well, these ways of seeing, this rigorous way of seeing the world, is not easy. If it were easy, everyone would be seeing it in those terms. But that subtractive process, subtracting our sense of the past, imposing itself upon the present into the future, is one route of access. Another route of access is, as I said, turn your head, look at the world upside down, so you no longer recognize the objects as immediately. And so you're freed from the heuristic representation. Another way to do it, another exercise, is realize that beyond these walls, anything or nothing could be happening. Anything or nothing is possible, in the sense that you imagine what's beyond these walls is what was there yesterday, the day before. You are confident what you will encounter, going outside. But in terms of coming to terms with the epistemic, the brute present reality, everything beyond these walls is when you are inside just a possibility. And you must subtract that from your sense of the experience, of the reality. It's what's involved, that's the price, of the epistemic. That's the price of achieving that rigorous representation that also achieves religious salvation. But there's an easier way also. There are always many ways, right? I emphasized, I think the last time, that Gauss, the great mathematician, ended up proving the fundamental theorem of algebra in 4 different ways. Okay, so there are always varieties of approaches, whatever the subject, whatever the issue, whatever the problem. The way in which the epistemic, and this does probably comport most closely with what Whitehead might embrace, or might most easily embrace. The imprint of the epistemic on our world is something that we don't have to squint. We don't have to close our eyes to see, because if we close our eyes, we are closing our eyes to our conceptualizations of the world. It's not something that we need to turn upside down, though we can do these exercises. It's not something that we have to imagine removing all our representations of the outside world from, right? Simplest, probably most accessible way to get a sense of the epistemic is, and in terms of what's obviously in front of our eyes that we are not seeing, not appreciating, is look around. The most general, the most important, the decisive feature of what you'll see is that it's different in different directions. That's something that tends not to be appreciated at all. It's something that no one tends to emphasize in terms of the nature of our experience. And yet that asymmetry is of the essence of epistemic space. Heuristic space has internal symmetries, identities, things that mirror each other, that resemble each other. Epistemic space is rigorously asymmetric, no internal symmetries, no points mirroring other points. And that's what we have in the broader sort of array of our experience as we look around. It's because of that asymmetry that a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible. It's because of that asymmetry that science is not a rigorous logic. It is a heuristic device that can help us build better cell phones, help us discover various things that are to our benefit in terms of survival, in terms of utility, usefulness. But in terms of salvation, it does not rise to the level of rigor that salvation operates at. And all I mean by salvation is what the true reality is. The ultimate reality is asymmetric. It is anomalous. It is distinctive and distinguishable point by point. So whatever applies to one point need not or does not, in fact, rigorously apply to another. May in fact turn out to apply over time approximately, but not rigorously so. That's the nature of our existence. And that is the condition ultimately of salvation, where salvation is a kind of freedom. That's all. The truth shall set you free. Well, this is the truth. That truth of rigorous representation will set you free from all of your approximate assessments, your premature assessments of experience. We suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. Now, we know in general that people are not seeing this brute reality, this epistemic reality. We know that people are not seeing what's in front of their eyes because in general, that people are seeing concepts fundamentally in front of their eyes because in general, people struggle to draw. Drawing is considered to be a difficult skill, a difficult task, certainly to draw at the level of a Rembrandt. Children, how do children draw? They draw like this, right? They draw stick figures. What's a stick figure? A stick figure is a representation not of how a person looks, but of the concept of a person. A child drawing in this way is drawing his or her concept of what they are seeing. They're drawing a circle, that's a concept of a face. They're drawing these lines, those are concepts of arms, of legs, of a body. They're not drawing what their eyes, what their retina is experiencing. That takes the training of an artist. But it turns out drawing is not in the hand, it's in the eye. It's a matter of seeing what your retina is experiencing, not seeing the concept, just seeing the patterns as they are presenting themselves, to your eye, to your brain, without the conceptualization that from the earliest age is part of a child's vision of the world. There's a section in Valeris's Bull early on that addresses that. Children see conceptually and draw as they see. Stick figures. But nature is only approximately geometry. Faces are never circles. The truth of the world is as Rembrandt drew, in singular precision. Children see to the concept of God. Rembrandt saw oppositely to the truth of Eden, in its specificity, in its asymmetries, in its distinctiveness, not conceptually. Now, I'm going to show you something. I'm not going to be bragging, okay? I'm showing this to make a point, okay? To illustrate what I'm saying here. I was born without the ability to draw. The one thing I failed or got a D on in my life in school was in, I don't know, 4th or 5th grade, we had to draw a milk bottle. And I drew it so badly that I think I got a D minus, maybe got an F. I don't remember anymore. I think I blocked out the memory. Okay, so drawing was not a native gift, not a talent of mine. Okay, but again, drawing is not in the hand, it's in the eyes, which means it's also in the understanding of what we are seeing and how to represent it. So, some years ago, I did begin to do art. Okay, and I'm going to show you not the first drawing I did. I don't have that here. I think it's in storage. But my second, third, and fourth drawings that were done within the first month of drawing. Okay. Now, and again, I'm showing this. Understand, I had no talent. Okay, I was not born with a talent to draw. I knew people in elementary school who were like 7, 8, who could draw virtually as if they were Rembrandt. Okay, not me. Okay, so, but here's my second drawing. This is of a girl, Laura, that I knew. My second drawing. Okay, these are pencil drawings. I know they're a little bit hard to see, a little bit faint. Here's my third pencil drawing. Notice these are not stick figures, right? And here is a fourth in that series. There were 4 of them. Okay, I don't know. I guess you can kind of see that. Okay, she's in the sun, and you can see that she's squinting into the sun. Okay, pencil drawings. Now, I know these are hard to see, so I'm going to tell you something, a little story. I did these during the summer, in the course of a month, as I said. And then I brought them to the high school that I graduated from to show them to a teacher that I was friendly with. He actually was an English teacher, but he had broad sensibilities. He taught the philosophy course that I took when I was in high school. It was a course that was based on, I've mentioned this in the past, Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy. It wasn't, I was reading much, sophisticated philosophy at that point, so I took it, because it was offered. And I learned a lot of biographical details about the lives of the philosophers discussed in that book. But the teacher became a friend of mine, as I said. He had broad and deep sensibilities, and I thought I would show him the drawings. Now, I visited the high school at lunchtime during the summer, and he was having lunch at a table with, it turns out, the main art teacher of the school, who had been a Disney artist, extraordinarily talented as a draftsman. He was a Disney animator. He had worked on Sleeping Beauty, and that represents like an apex, of the drafting, of a skilled draftsman to be hired by Disney for one of its major films. So he was extraordinarily gifted as a draftsman, probably the single most gifted person I've known, in terms of drawing. Well, he was at the table, and I laid out these drawings. I did not know him prior to that encounter. And he looked at them, and he said to me, how long have you been drawing? And I said, as I mentioned, a month. His face transformed. And he said, I I can't process this. I trust you're telling me the truth, but the simple fact of the matter is, if you had answered, oh, I've been drawing for about 16 years, that would make sense. Producing those drawings in a month, that type of sensitivity and whatever the components of the drawings were, that makes no sense to me. And he became my art mentor. And when I started doing pastels, I would bring them over to him, and he would, critique them. And we developed a close, relationship in terms of, again, like mentor and someone, mentor and student. I didn't go to art school. I was self-taught in that way. The point is that those apparently were seen by him as remarkable drawings. I have no talent at drawing, okay? What's operating there is really the result of my philosophical understanding of the process, not my dexterity, not my natural talent, okay? So I show those just to show you another dimension, another aspect of what these talks, what philosophy amounts to. That with sufficient philosophic understanding, one can, achieve results that one would not expect philosophy would have a bearing upon. But as I stressed, and as I always stress, philosophy relates to everything. And so philosophy can help us in every way, in every direction, even when it comes to understanding the drawing process. That one has to learn not to see conceptually, but to see what is really right in front of one's eyes. And that's what I did in those drawings. Okay? So again, it's a testament to the power of philosophical results. We had no questions last time, so I can go on a little longer. I wanted to make the point that there is seeing epistemically, right, where we want to subtract from our experience of the world everything that is speculative or presumptive or based on assumption, right? So that we come to rigorous representation, the rigorous epistemic divergent reality. But when we want to come to terms with things within heuristic space, right, when we want to come to understand a heuristic result, the nature of an object, what's a heuristic result? Well, a novel might be a heuristic result, a poem, things that are an assembly of elements, right, where we understand them as a clustering, a concatenation, a convergence of elements. Then we want repeated encounters, right? That's the point of the battering ram example I've given in the past. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is insanity. No, it's the path to mastery, right? You have to re-encounter in order to appreciate something. And it's not just a matter of re-encountering, it's a matter of encountering from varieties of directions. Okay? Van Gogh, famously, and I use his example repeatedly, was not appreciated in his lifetime, right? Why not? What's different now? Why are people paying $150 million for a painting now when in his lifetime he could only sell one for $80? And his reputation grew rapidly, exponentially. Not long after his death. It wasn't like it took 500 years to come to appreciate Van Gogh. Well, the difference, obviously, is everything, right? As of the sparrow, everything matters. What we know of his biography makes us see his art differently. What we know of his life feeds into. These are all the convergent elements that bear upon the experience of seeing something and seeing it differently. Right? When we saw a Van Gogh, if we saw a Van Gogh 100 years ago, we're not seeing it from the perspective of another 100 years of art history, of 100 years of appreciation, of 100 years of journal articles and books and museum shows and a celebration of his life and his art. We were not in his time seeing it from the perspective of his letters, how penetrating and intelligent, his letters were. We were not seeing it from the perspective of his death. We were not seeing it from the perspective of the tragic circumstances of his life. All of those elements converge, cohere to change how we view the painting, which in a sense remains unchanged, right? Nobody has painted over, nobody has embellished the surface of his work. It's the what? Convergence of all kinds of elements, factors, experiences, writings, appreciations that go into the contemporary response to Van Gogh. The response to a heuristic object is through modes of and accretions of convergence over time. Everything matters, every element matters. It's an additive process, that process of appreciation. Whereas the epistemic is achieved through a subtractive process, the opposite. I've emphasized the experience of the epistemic versus the heuristic. One of the things that we know is a mark of the heuristic is recognition, right? Seeing the same thing repeatedly. That is a hallmark of the epistemic, what we can name, what we can describe. The epistemic is related to the sublime. It is strange, it is beautiful, it is new. It is eternally new, moment to moment. Another way to come to terms with the epistemic or move in the direction of the epistemic in our heuristic experience is to always seek out novelty. There's a great producer of television in Hollywood, Norman Lear, an illustrious career. I think he might be 100 now or close to 100. I read an interview with him not too long ago, and he emphasized that he goes out every day on a drive, down from his house, and the same road, same path, but he makes it a point to see something new, notice something new every day. Novelty is the mark of the epistemic, radical novelty, moment after moment after moment. So that's another means of moving in the direction of that philosophically rigorous representation. Novelty. Obviously, we're not, in general, seeing the world radically new, moment to moment. Our brains don't easily permit that without extraordinary effort and training. And I do not have that level of training to do that. But the point is the degree to which we can at least observe the novelty in what seems like repetitive patterns is moving us away from the heuristic towards an appreciation of the epistemic, the fundamental reality. Okay, we're sort of at the end. I wanted to read a couple of things, I guess, to close. One is a work, an aphoristic work that I did called Cinematic Worlds. Cinematic refers to the visual. Okay, that's one of the reasons why I chose it. Now remember, when it comes to my aphoristic writings, they're very concentrated. They have a poetic sort of aspect. There's a musical quality to them. Don't try to understand. Don't think that if you don't understand just as you hear them, there's something wrong with you. No, they're hard, but I read them to just expose everyone to another way in which the philosophy is represented. So here is cinematic. Let me see. Did I show you all the images I wanted to show you? Well, here, let me quickly show. Okay, there is Schopenhauer. I didn't show you Schopenhauer as a young man. There is Nietzsche as kind of a middle-aged man, I guess. Confucius and Eva. There were some people I didn't mention. Oh, and here's Norman Lear. That's Nietzsche. Yes. Okay. Cinematic worlds. Let me just pull it up here. It's very short. Oops. Wait 1 second. Hold on. I have to get it. Where is it? Okay, let me put my glasses on. Okay, cinematic worlds. The tragic sense of life presumes social spaces. 1. We suffer pattern in unresolved domains. 2. Existence is singular, that it is epistemic. 3. We think it heuristic, that society is a technology. 4. And so, we live and die a tragedy to cinematic worlds. That's a sort of a summary of everything I've been saying, but a very concentrated summary, right? And then finally, I wanted to read something from Phalaris's Bull, the end of Phalaris's Bull, because it turns out there's a line at the end of Phalaris's Bull that's rise such fine, splendid eyes. You can see the connection, right? Rise such fine, splendid eyes. It actually was the name of this pole. There was a time when I named poles, and they were often named with a line or two that had a poetic quality. Rise such fine, splendid eyes. Okay? So again, the emphasis upon seeing, upon apprehension, as we started. And the conclusion to Phalaris's Bull goes, which again is a summary of what I've been saying, and so rise, such fine, splendid eyes, to see the solution to the world, epistemically unfurled, that 2 points are not equal to 1, and 1 is equal to none. This the rigor of the Trinity, and every mode of divinity, and every claim to ever make of every path we ever take. And so at last, we find our way back to the boundless fields of Eden. And those fields of Eden are what epistemic space and its logic provides. That is the ultimate reality, always right in front of our eyes. Okay, that is today's talk. You'll notice too, in line with our visual theme, I have a new webcam and I have a new light, so the visual aspect of the talk, I think, has been improved. Anyway, that concludes tonight's talk. I know Aaliyah was having a little trouble with her mouth, so it's a little hard for her to talk at the moment. So we want to keep her talking to a minimum. I'm sure she'll be better next week and will be much more talkative. But at the moment, it's probably better that she not talk too much. So I want to thank Aaliyah. And again, I want to thank the American Consulate, everyone involved in providing this platform. I want to thank you, the audience. I want to thank you for your questions. I will be sent the questions. We'll address them if we have questions next time at the end. And again, I hope to see you next week, and I encourage you to join weekly. The the best way to understand, philosophy, my philosophical work, is repeated exposure. Okay.
So thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, the audience, for joining us. And just very quickly, Yerkan, I'm going to announce your questions. Good morning, Professor. Again, Yerkan, what kind of functions of philosophy is important in modern world?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a teacher of philosophy at the local university, and I'm interested in which methodology of teaching you recommend.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your questions, Irkan. One more time, thank you, the audience, for joining us. Thank you very much, Stephen. And we will all see you next week. Goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. See you next time.